Kind of coerced a little bit, but I'm here nonetheless. It doesn't matter. You're here. And I don't believe in coincidence or accident. And so I'm convinced that Father has a word in due season for you. But before we get into tonight's Torah portion, and we're going to spend about maybe a half hour, a little longer, depending on how engaging you are. Because if you really are engaging, it'll be a short message. If you're not, it'll be a long message. Okay? But anyway, we're in the process of moving. How many of you knew that? Everybody did? Well, we're in the process of moving over to a place on South Salem off of Commercial, right behind Northern Lights Theater. And hopefully we'll be able to go over there this Sunday afternoon and do some work that needs to be done. And we're praying that we get the prints back from the architect, hopefully Monday at the latest. And that way we can begin to implement some things that we need to do as far as construction is concerned. So we need you to be praying with us. If you're able to help, all you have to do is contact one of the elders. I know that there are a number of... One of the elders in the congregation, raise your hand. I see Fred here. I see Wendell in the back. There's Roland. I saw Tim here at the table as well. So if you can help in any fashion, if it's nothing more than... And that sounds almost condescending, doesn't it? Nothing more than praying. That's the most powerful thing you could be doing. Petitioning the heavens with prayer. But if you can, why don't you see one of these elders and let them know when you might be available. And we're in the process of scheduling some things so that we can take advantage of everyone who's willing to help us, because many hands make light work. Isn't that right? Amen. Wow. I'm really excited tonight. You must have been that part of the group that was forced here, right? Hello. Well, what I'd like to do, it sounds as if we're having a little sound issue, and I don't know. Sometimes it's because the wind rushes through my ears and then hits this mic. It might not be your fault. It might not be Wendell's fault in the back. It just could be because of the ear problem where the wind's rushing through. Some of you have never had that, right? Never had that? Hallelujah. Yeah. Woo. Yes. Anyway. I'm delighted you're here. Why don't we look in the Torah portion tonight? Would you like to? Yeah. How many of you read the Torah portion? How many of you are familiar with it? The story of the Torah portion is entitled Balak. And it's so filled with things that are pertinent to the season that you and I are living in that it is amazing to me. There's quite a number of questions that people usually come up with. There's really a running argument regarding whether or not Balak was a true prophet of God or a false prophet. I happen to be on that side that thinks that he was a false prophet, and I don't mind midrashing with you if you have a difference of opinion. But what I'm going to do, since I have the mic tonight, I'm going to present my opinion, and then we'll give you an opportunity to banter that back and forth off the air without a mic. Just picking. What I want to do is to look at some things regarding this Torah portion, and it begins in Numbers chapter 22, verse 2. And automatically, those two numbers caught my attention because the number 22 is associated with the 22 letters of the alphabet. And people argue and say there's really not much of a need for numeric values or gematria. And in particular, when you look at the chapter divisions, it was a man that actually put those in there. Well, whether or not it was, all I know is that I believe Abba orchestrated it. And I don't think it's an accident that right here in this Torah portion, where it begins, Numbers chapter 22, verse 2, there's something inherent about the number 22, the Aleph Beit, and the number 2, which is the letter that represents the house. And so what we're seeing here, Father's about to reveal something concerning the Aleph and Tav, the 22 letters of the Aleph Bet, which represents the Messiah and his relationship to the house. And I believe that when you see that, you're also going to see a counterfeit as well in this particular Torah portion. There are two principal characters that you probably are familiar with. One of those is Balak, who was the king of the Moabites. And the other one is Balaam or Balaam. And as we look at these two names, you're going to see that they embody the character of the two individuals. You know, it's interesting, if you study the Hebrew, you know that every Hebrew word has both a blessing and a curse attached to it or associated with it, depending on one's relationship with the Creator. And if you happen to have a name that you have not researched to see what the etymological or roots or the origin of it is, I would suggest that you do so. Simply because once you start looking at the name, you'll note that there's a character that's been implemented in that name, and you want to be careful to measure up to the blessing that's associated with the name rather than the curse. Does that make sense to you? And you're going to find out that your words have power in them. In fact, what's amazing here is that Balak, the king of the Moabites, has been witnessing what happened with Israel and their enemies and how Moshe led them in victory over the Sihon and some of the other monstrous individuals, the giants in that land. And so he realizes that he cannot defeat them from the natural. And the interesting thing is that what he decides that he's going to do, he's going to solicit someone to engage them with his words. And he's going to solicit this prophet, false prophet in my opinion. What he's going to do is to attempt to solicit this false prophet to speak words against the house of Israel, expecting to have victory over them, a victory over them that he could not have achieved from the natural. Does that make sense to you? Isn't that kind of a conundrum? Because if you look at a natural physical enemy and you know that you cannot overcome them with your physical prowess, you understand that if you begin to resort to placing strategically the Word of Yah in your life and in the lives of those around you, did you know that you can have a direct effect on them? And that's what you're going to see in this Torah portion. Now, the word Balak, if you had a Strong's Concordance, it's number 1111. And I thought, again, there's another interesting number. They don't just happen to come up. 11 and 11 is 22. Okay? There's the number 22 again. His name is written in the Hebrew, Beit Lamed Kuf. And it is normally translated as meaning waste or a devastator. But it can also be rendered as empty or void. How would you like to name your child? Oh, come here, void. Come here, empty. Oh, there's the devastator. Hello? Well, you know, they used to say that about me. They used to tell me I'd tear up a bowling ball. Hello? You see what I'm saying? The words that we speak over our children, over our husbands, over our wives, over our situation can have a tremendous effect regarding whether or not you have victory or are able to achieve that victory in your life. You see that? Now, let's look at this name Balaam, Strong's number 1109. It's written Beit Lamed Ayin Mim. And the way it is normally translated, it is defined as meaning not of the people. Bal-am, not of the people. The word am is a word that's usually translated as people or nation. And it's interesting to note, both of these two individuals have the same two-letter root stem in their name, the Beit Lamed, in Balak and in Bilam. And if you look at how that word is usually used, the Beit Lamed root, it conveys with it the idea of detrition, something that's losing, it's wasting away, just like the word devastator. Something that is wasting away, something that atrophy is setting in. Does that make sense to you? Now, if you look at the remaining letters, the Kuf, which represents the back of the head, indicating the one that comes behind, it has a prophetic implication because it's referencing the Messiah, who is the head that we'll see at the end days. He's the one who's coming at the end. And it has a numeric value of 100, which happens to be the same as the Hebrew word kaf. And the Hebrew word kaf is written with the letters kaf pei, which means the hand. And so when you see that letter kuf and the numeric value, it's indicating that the one who's coming at the last is going to have authority and power in his hand. Is that what you're expecting of your returning Messiah? He's going to have authority and power in his hand. What is he going to come back with? What do you remember issuing forth out of his mouth? A sharp two-edged sword. And that sword is nothing short of his word, Yahweh's word. Am I correct? Well, aren't you supposed to be created in the image and likeness of Yahweh if you're being shaped into that or formed into that image by depositing his word on the inside of you? Aren't you supposed to be? Well, if that's the case, you also should have his power and his authority in your hand. Am I correct? You should have enough confidence in his word to know that whatever might be looming on the horizon in front of you, whether it's a mountain, that might stand between you as a form of opposition concerning what Father has in your life, you can speak to that mountain according to Mark chapter 11 and say, "Mountain, be thou removed and be cast into the sea." Am I right? Now, if you continue to read it, it says, well, you can't doubt in your heart, but you have to believe those things that you saith. And if you go back and look at it, it mentions believing one time, and then on 3 different occasions it mentions to speak or to say, indicating that what you say is at least 3 times more important than what you believe. In fact, you can't separate the two, because what comes out of your mouth is going to be what you believe. And so it becomes incumbent upon you to learn to speak what His Word says. And if it's not what His Word says, then you're going to have to change what you believe. Am I right? Amen. If you're not careful, listen to me. Everybody look at me for a second. If you're not careful, you'll become a Balaam. And you will be solicited by the enemy of the people, to pronounce curses on the very house of Yahweh. Did you understand what I just said? This is a role-playing model here. Because like it or not, we are in the shadow picture that's being displayed. Now let's look a little bit further. You find in Numbers chapter 22 verse 1 that the house of Israel is camped in the place known as the plains of Moab. Every one of these Hebrew names and words are very important. The word for plains here is pronounced Arabah from Strong's number 6160, and it is translated plain or steppes, an arid, sterile area of the wilderness. But it just so happens this same word is spelt with the same consonants as the Hebrew word Arabah, which means to pledge something, indicating a collateral that's exchanged between individuals who have cut a covenant or have an agreement with one another. Okay? And so now you find that the children of Israel are in a place, it looks as if from the natural that's a sterile, arid place where there's no fruit visible to the eye. And yet you find this same word means that we have a collateral agreement, indicating no matter what I see with my eyes, it may look as if there's no fruit being born, but I have some collateral in this covenant relationship with Yahweh, and I have an effect. My words on what I speak, my words indicate that I can see fruitfulness burst in a place that's arid, dry, and sterile. Hello? Do you know that you can have what you say? In fact, you're having what you've been saying. Hello? Let's look a little further. The word Arabah is the name of the plains, the location of this specific time that they spent in Moab. And the word Moab, I'm sure you remember who Moab was, right? He's the offspring of an incestuous relationship between Lot's daughters, 2 daughters, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's interesting, if you follow the lineage, if you will, of Moab and Ammon, you can see that there is a black cloud, a curse that hangs over these 2 individuals throughout history. But it's also interesting to remember that Yahweh's mercy is infinite and His mercy endures forever, and Ruth was a Moabite. And so, if you're willing to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob like Ruth was, then your nature can be changed as well, and the curse that had been on you can be lifted, and you can be brought into the lineage of the Creator. Does that make sense? When's the last time you read 2 Peter chapter 1 when it tells you that you've been given exceeding great and precious promises? And that the purpose of those exceeding great and precious promises are to allow you to become partakers of the divine lineage. Did you hear what I just said? The word lineage indicates that I can be grafted into a new bloodline. And the purpose of being grafted into a new bloodline by those promises means I can escape the corruption that is in the world through lust. Are y'all making a connection with this tonight? What does this have to do with Balak and Balaam? The children of Israel are in a place where they're going to be involved in another test. And we've been watching them throughout these Torah portions. We saw that you had the testing of the 10 spies, and we had Korah's rebellion, and now all of a sudden they're in the midst of another test. And listen to me, these are teaching tools for you and I, because right now, the conundrum that you find, Balak and Balaam presenting to the house of Israel is exactly where you and I are camped at this present moment. The word Moab is rendered of his father. Sounds kind of like it's almost a generic term, of his father. Aren't I of my father? Hello? And so it's an indicator that your nature and your character, even the name planted on you, if you're not careful, will expose who your daddy is. Yeah. Turn around and ask your neighbor, who's my baby's daddy? Hello? You see the point I'm getting at? Who is your father? Aren't we supposed to be emulating him? And is it possible that our character, and honestly, your character is embodied in your name. You can't separate the two. Listen to me. And so the way that we live, the way that we conduct ourselves exposes who our Father is. It kind of puts us on a thin ice, doesn't it? When we begin to consider our actions. And let's look just a little further. The word Moab is written Mem Vav Aleph Beit. And there are some translators that feel that there should have been a Mem Yod root here rather than the Mem Vav. And if it wasn't the case, it would have made that word the waters of the Father, which is a euphemistic term to indicate the Father's seed. And if that was an incestuous relationship, then you could understand it. But in fact, it's still indicating that whatever seed is planted on the inside of you. Is there any way we could get a different mic maybe? I don't know where the feedback's coming from. But it's indicating that the seed on the inside of us is identifying who our Father is. Is that making sense to you? Yes. Is it? Are y'all asleep? Y'all give me just a second. We'll change this mic. Testing. All right. It looks like we've got a little more volume. Hello. Anyway, and I apologize for that, but if it's not going to affect me, then don't let it affect you, okay? Turn to your neighbor and tell him, he's got it under control. It's going to be better now. You know, that's exactly what I was asking him before tonight's service. I said, what am I supposed to say? And I've got the notes. And it indicates that we need to be real careful with what goes in us, because what's deposited in us determines what comes out of our mouth. We're going to look at this. It's hinting at the bitter waters of jealousy in this word Moab. And you know the bitter waters of jealousy. You see that demonstrated in Numbers chapter 5. You see that in the flood account beginning in Genesis chapter 6. You can see it culminating in the book of Revelation, where the Babylon, the mother of harlots, is given again the bitter cup of jealousy to drink. And so you can see this here in this encounter with the Moabites. And so it's leading me to believe that the children of Israel are shortly before being offered a bitter cup to drink. And this bitter cup is there to expose those who are going to prostitute themselves to fallen gods, become adulterous in their relationship with Yahweh. Am I right? That's what's being exposed here. Now, Israel is on this side. If you go back and read it in the Hebrew language, it says they are in the plains of Moab on this side of Jordan. The word for side here is the word Eber, and we get the word Hebrew from it. And so now the Hebrews are about to be exposed. The word for Hebrew or Eber means in opposition to something. And if anybody would ask you tonight, why do you call yourself a Hebrew? Well, then you should automatically be able to tell them, I'm standing in opposition. Well, in opposition to what? Hello? What are you opposing? Whom are you in opposition to? Well, I would submit that we have to be in opposition to the enemy of the Torah. And that's exactly what's being alluded to here. Now, if you look at the word Jordan, there on this side of Jordan, Yarden, Strong's number 3383, it's written Yod Resh Dalet Nun, and it's translated as descender. Why? Because it's down from Mount Hermon, and it flows into the Dead Sea. But if you look at how it's broken up in the Hebrew language, you have the Yod Resh, and if you look at the root of that, That word means watchers, fallen ones. That's where we get the Nephilim from. Are y'all familiar with this? And if you study the River Jordan, the headwaters are at the base of Mount Hermon and actually issue forth out of the ground. And that place, even to this day, is known as the gates of hell. And that's where Yeshua carried his disciples. And it's on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee. And he took them to the Galil. And he told them, looking at this gate, he says, the gates of hell shall not prevail against the ecclesia, the called out ones, my assembly. And literally he's talking about the spiritual entities that are represented by these quote-unquote gates of hell. Are y'all still with me thus far? You guys are going to have to do better than you're doing, because it looks as if you've got this fog across your face. Are y'all getting any of it? Yeah. Smile and nod, because I told you if you don't stay with me, we're going to be a long time. All right? Smile and nod. There you go. All right. The Yod Resh indicates watchers. The Dalet Nun is the word we get Dan, or judgment, from. And so it's indicating that this River Jordan becomes a source or a place where the seed of the watchers, the waters of the watchers, the seminal fluid of the watchers are going to be judged or cut off. And if you go back and read Joshua chapter 3, verse 16, this is exactly what happens. The children of Israel are told to go into the promised land, right? And they're to occupy the promised land. But Yahweh tells them specifically that there were 7 Canaanite nations that have to be destroyed. And those 7 nations were part of the offspring of these watchers. That was the natural. That was what you could see above the ground. The root of it was the spiritual seed. And it's when the children of Israel cross over the river Yarden, that's when this spiritual seed is cut off, when the waters were divided from the waters and piled up on a heap. Can y'all see that? Yep. Now, what does that have to do with Balak and Balaam? I'm building something here to teach you why Father tells you exactly where they're at. Tells you these locations, gives you these names. They're in the plains of Moab, on this side of Yarden, near or in the proximity of Jericho. And you remember the Battle of Jericho. Everybody's familiar with it, right? Jericho happened to be the seat of that particular time of pagan sun and moon worship. In fact, the word Jericho is literally translated as city of the moon. But again, you'll note Jericho is spelled Yod-Resh Ket Vav. It has that same Yod Resh root that we were just looking at. Again, hinting at a connection of the seed of those watchers. What does that have to do with Balak and Balaam? I'm going to tell you. You see, there's natural seed and there's spiritual seed. Everything that you see in the natural realm is going to be a direct result of something that's taken place in the spirit realm. Every battle that you're engaged in the natural realm, there was a spiritual battle that had already been waged, and you're seeing the result of it, the seed planted. Am I right? If you look at that word Jericho, the Ket Vav indicates to put something forth and to reveal it. And I believe that the purpose of Yahweh sending Israel, first of all, right there to the city of Jericho, after having crossed this river Jordan, it was a boundary line. They cross over this boundary line. They go to the city of Jericho for the express purpose of exposing the seed of the enemy, the seed of the watchers. Now, why is that? What does that have to do with Balak and Balaam? Well, there's evidently something happening behind the scenes. There's a war being waged between the seed line. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Are y'all still with me? Okay? And as we see here that Balak is attempting to have the house of Israel cursed in the natural. He can't defeat them in a physical battle, and so he's going to solicit this prophet, and this prophet's supposed to curse them. And so now let's look. We've already looked at the word Balak, but let's look at his lineage, his pedigree for a second. He was the son of Zippor, Strong's number 6834, which is usually translated as a sparrow or a bird. It's the same name that Moshe's first wife had. Zipporah was from this same root. And that word, if you break it down, you look at how it's spelled. Zadi, Pei, Vav, Resh. The Hebrew letter Zadi indicates righteous or righteousness, while the Pei, Vav, Resh root indicates to bring something to naught. to cause the plans of a people or a nation to be brought to nothing. Wow, are you beginning to see something in the character of Zippor passed on to Balak? We're going to change mics again. Are y'all having a good time? How would you like to trade places with me? And still maintain your sanity. Smile and nod. Aren't you excited? And see, honestly, what I believe is happening, I believe there's a battle being waged in the spirit realm behind the scene. And the reason I believe that is because you're seeing the evidence. The enemy does not want you to hear this short teaching tonight. And so I would be all the more engaged simply because I see that this battle is being waged to keep me from seeing what's happening. Now, Zippor begins with that Zadi, which indicates righteousness. And the Pei Vav Resh root means to bring something to nothing, to cause the plans of the people or nation to be brought to nothing. And as I said, Balak knows that he cannot overwhelm the military might of Israel. So he's attempting to solicit this man to speak against him. Everybody look at me for a second. Have you ever been solicited to speak against anybody else? Well, let me just give you a more common term for it. Gossip. You got it, brother. Gossip. Rumor mongering. Backbiting. Infighting. Are you seeing this? Oh, isn't that painful when that self-examination begins to take place? Now, these words that he's soliciting Balaam to speak, it seems to me that he believes that there's more power on these words spoken than all of the military might of the nation of Moab. One man speaking words is more powerful than an entire nation's military might. And the Moabites, if you go back and look at history, the Moabites were a pretty powerful nation. One man's word was more powerful. Or at least this is what Balak thought. And so you have to ask yourself, how powerful are your words? Are your words more powerful than the physical enemy that you're facing? Are your words more powerful than the physical battle you're currently in? Are your words more powerful than the circumstance that seems to be swirling around you? Gloom, despair, and agony on me. Deep dark depression, excessive misery. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Oh, and I'm sorry, you were agreeing with me, weren't you? I'm not prophesying over you. I'm just telling you what I hear commonly come out of people's mouths. If we really felt like our spiritual words were more powerful than the physical enemies that we're facing, it would change things instantly in the spirit realm. Say amen right there. Now, let's look a little further. Zadi Pei Vav Resh. If you look at that Zadi Pei root, you see it in another interesting word that's connected to Zippor. It's the word Zaphath, and it means to chirp and to twitter. And by the way, most gossipers are prone to chirping and twittering. You know, and I like the way that Elizabethan English refers to it in the New Testament. It's called vain janglings. Hello? Have you never heard of that? Go back and look at it. It's called vain janglings in the English, in the Elizabethan English. And so if you're prone to worthless things, passing on stuff that doesn't matter, and just silly foolishness that genders strife and confusion and division, then you're just a vain jangler. Hello? Now, it's getting better. That word Saphah is actually associated with the sounds that spiritualists and those that were involved in the occult would use to summon their gods and spirits. Did you hear what I just said? Did you hear what I just said? Do you think maybe my gossip and backbiting, my rumor mongering, and all the backstabbing things that I've seen to be prone to do, you think maybe it's being used to help summon a god? I'm just asking you, when I said God's a little g, a spirit, do you think maybe I'm just giving the demonic influences that are around me some tools to work with? I'm helping the enemy. No wonder Brad Scott says he believes the devil's in at least semi-retirement. Because you and I are doing his job for him. Say amen. Now, I told you, This message is where we're living at today. Now, let's look at that word, Sapha. Oh, hallelujah. We're out of that. There's no conviction. If he's not talking, we're not under conviction. Listen to me. The enemy's doing some things to solicit us, to engage us, to use us to our own demise. John 10:10 says, the thief comes but to steal, kill, and destroy. I've come that you could have life and that more abundantly. Don't aid and abet the enemy in your own life and in the lives of others. And there's going to be lots of opportunities in the days ahead for us to do that as this stuff begins to heat up. Now, I want to look at that word Zapha or Zippor, because it's also seen in another word that you're really familiar with. How many of you remember the plague of frogs? Did you know the word for frog in Hebrew is from this same root, Zephwardia? Now you got to ask yourself, because it seems as if I'm just wandering all over the place, but I'm going to connect to every one of these dots, and I'm going to show you that there's a connection with this plague of frogs and what's about to happen here with Balak and Balaam and what's about to happen with you. And I'm going to tell you there's another plague of frogs that's coming. And I'm going to tell you, if you're not careful, you'll be like Pharaoh, and you'll want to spend just one more night with the frogs. Are you serious? You want to hear the rest of it? Let's look a little further. The word Zephwardia has a Zadi Pei Resh root. And it's interesting, the latter two letters, the Dalet Ayin, it means knowledge. And so now, connected with this word Zippor and the word Zapha, both of them hinting at something regarding the language, worthless, backbiting, gossiping, that have a tendency to draw the demonic influences close to the one who's guilty of it. You still with me? And you also see that it's revealing to us, this last two letter, Dalet Ayin, indicates knowledge. And so what's happening when you saw that plague of frogs, it's actually demonstrating the power of Yahweh over or against the knowledge that Egypt and Israel had at that time, that they had gained from their soothsayers and their magicians. Because it was the soothsayers and magicians who were twittering and twerping, given to soothsaying against the word of Yah. Are you listening to me? Am I trying to say that if you're prone to gossip and backbiting, you may not be the one that initiates it, you just give it a womb for it to grow in? Hello? Are you listening to me? Am I saying that you are falling into that same category as a soothsayer? One whose words are against the words of the Almighty. In fact, if you go back and look at the word for serpent, Nakash, it literally is defined as one who is a soothsayer, an enchanter. And he's one who's given to speaking against or compromising the word of Yah. Isn't that what Balak is soliciting Balaam to do, speak against the word of Yah? You making that connection yet? Well, if you go back and study that particular plague, the frogs were literally worshipped as a god in Egypt. And if you go back and study history, there was a death penalty associated with killing frogs. And in fact, if you accidentally killed a frog, you could be put to death. These frogs represented one of their deities that was worshipped. Why? Because of the twittering, twerping, soothsaying, oracles that was attributed to the mouth of the frog. Did you realize that there's going to be frogs that are released in the last days? Go back and read it. In the book of Revelation, it says that there were unclean spirits. Are y'all remember that? Like frogs that are going to be released to do what? To seduce the nations. The plague of frogs is coming again. And because the house of Egypt knew that there was a death penalty for having to kill one of those frogs, the frogs just piled up. And you know the interesting thing? Yahweh killed them all. And He proved to them who was the supreme, quote-unquote, deity in this situation. Now, what was happening is that He's destroying the oracles, the soothsaying, the false words that were attributed to these frogs. The very ones that had seduced the house of Israel. Now, it seems to me that what's happening is that Balak is following this same pattern. He's attempting to solicit Balaam to prophesy a false word in order to seduce the house of Israel. And so it seems as if he's following the same pattern. And if you look at Balak, when he solicits Balaam, Balaam was from the house of Beor. He was the son of Beor. And if you look at the word Beor, it's usually translated as meaning burning. The bait that's prefixed to it indicates the house or the bride, while the Ayin Vav Resh root again hints at that word watchers, fallen ones. Balak, or Balaam rather, was from the house that was associated with the fallen ones. It also can indicate to be made naked, to be made exposed, like exposing the father's bed, which is exactly what happened in Genesis chapter 3. Don't worry, that's Yahweh calling. Sorry, he was trying to get to a message to you, and it happened to be the only way he could get in touch. So don't bother me when the phone rings. The word Ayin Vav Resh can also be translated as skin. And so you find this Balaam from the house of Beor lodging at the place called Pethor, which means soothsayers. Have you ever noticed that if an individual is prone to a specific type of sin, that he will have a tendency to gravitate towards others that are prone or given to that same type of character flaw? Do you really believe that? If you really believe it, raise your hand and then look at the people that you're sitting around the table with. Hello. Prayerfully, you're seeing a different character, nature, than what's being exposed in this Torah portion. But you follow my line of thought. Am I right? You follow me? Now, there's another connection being made here regarding these spiritual powers that are working behind the scenes. That word soothsaying is again connected to the word Nakash, the serpent who was a whisperer. Hath God said? Is that really what he meant? Don't worry about it. It's just a matter of the heart. It's how you feel in your heart and not what your attitude is. He's not one of those that's going to judge his people anymore. Don't worry about the Torah. Just spread this stuff around a little more. When you look at the word Pethor, that Pei Tav root pot can indicate a doorway or an opening. And it also can represent, as a metaphor, it represents the private parts of a female's anatomy, where the womb is located. The womb is a doorway. Are you beginning to see the pattern, how these fallen ones gather in places where those that are susceptible to their seed can easily be seduced? Oh, don't worry about it. I'm just going over there. I'm going to convert them very quickly. It wouldn't take me but just a few minutes. They're not going to change me. I can hang around in that crowd and not be affected. Hello? Well, if you look a little bit further, that Hebrew letter Pei means to speak. It represents the mouth. This is where it was from, Pethor. And if you looked at the Tav Vav Resh root, it can also indicate a standard, specifically a standard that's defined, a line that's drawn in the sand like the Torah. And so here's a man that's at a place where it's looking as if he's attempting to compromise the standard of Yahweh's Word. We're talking about Balaam here. Oh, Balaam was a genuine prophet. Okay, you're entitled to your opinion. I'm convinced that he was a soothsayer rather than a prophet. And I believe he's in the same vein as Jannes and Jambres, the two magicians that opposed Moshe. They were the magicians of Pharaoh. And it's interesting that they could only speak just so far in opposition to Moshe, just like you see Balaam here. And you find that he's attempting to oppose Yahweh and curse Israel, but he realizes that he can't. And so what happens is Balak is attempting to get him to use the same tactics, the same method of the serpent to kind of ease around behind the scenes rather than the overt methods. But let's look a little further, because I believe that there's a hint even in the encounter with this donkey. How many of you remember one of the funniest stories in the Torah, and that's Balaam's ass, Balaam's donkey? Hello? You know, that used to be me. I can just picture myself riding on the back of this donkey, and this thing rammed my foot into a wall, and even though it starts speaking to me, I would be so overwhelmed with anger, I'd still be beating it, knowing this donkey just spoke to me supernaturally. Some of you have never been there, right? Yeah, some of you have never been there. Some of you probably have. Let's look at that word for donkey, and you can find it in Numbers chapter 22, verse 23. Are you getting anything? Because I can quit if you're not. This word for donkey here, Strong's number 860. You need to write this down because you're about to see an anomaly in the Scripture. Strong's number 860 is the word athon, and it's translated donkey here, or she-ass, and it's not the traditional word used. It's the word athon rather than chamor. And it just caught my attention. And I found that it has the same consonantal root, the aleph, tav, nun, as the word etan, which means a gift or a hire for prostitution. Harlot's pay. And if you look a little bit at the Hebrew, the aleph, tav root again represents Messiah, his language, his word, the Messiah himself. That vav nun suffix to the aleph tav, the word athon, indicates to make it small or to diminish it, to bring it to nothing. And again, if you remember the Beit Lamed root, which refers to Baal, the pagan deity of the Canaanite nations, and the word Baal, if you can remember, is also usually rendered or translated as Lord or husband, right? Remember that, because something about the husband of Israel is being revealed to you here. Because that's exactly what Balaam is going to do. He's going to teach Balak and the Moabites how to compromise Yahweh's bride and diminish the husband in the process. That's exactly what happened in Genesis 3, isn't it? Okay? The ayin mem root is Am, or people, and thus Balaam was a shadow picture of the prophet of the people who would also represent their husband. Wait a minute. That sounds like another prophet who came riding on a donkey, representing the husband of the house of Israel. Doesn't it? Do you think maybe that there's an archetype or a counterfeit being revealed to us here in Balaam riding on this donkey versus Zephaniah chapter 9 when it talks about one who would enter into Jerusalem riding on a donkey? Let's look a little further. In Revelation 19:10 it tells us that the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy. Am I correct? Well, this guy's a prophet, and so he should have been testifying of Yeshua in this particular case. Let's look a little further. And so, as we look at that word athon for donkey, you'll note it's used 14 times in Numbers chapter 22, verses 21 through 33. Not one time is this word for donkey used in any of the books previous to the book of Numbers, and it's only used 2 other times after this. One of those is in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 24, where the Shunammite woman comes to Elisha on behalf of her son who's dead. It's about death and subsequent resurrection. And the other time is in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, concerning that very same prophecy of Messiah who would come to redeem his people. And yet you notice that this same word, athon, is connected with Balaam and in these 2 instances. All the other times, there are other words like the word chamor for donkey or ass used. It's only here that this particular term is used to describe the donkey that Balak would ride, or Balaam rather. And so I believe that it's actually a juxtaposition of the role of Messiah versus that of the Anti-Messiah. Yeshua becomes the harlot's price. Remember we talked about that word athon? It literally means the gift or hire of a prostitute. He becomes the price that's paid. so that you and I would no longer be accused of being an adulterous bride, prostituting ourselves to pagan deities. Am I correct? And it's ironic because you find Balaam soliciting the house of Israel to engage in prostituting themselves not only to the Moabites, but specifically the gods of the Moabites, which happen to be not only Baal, but Chemosh and Milcom. And if you go back and study Chemosh and Milcom and Ishtar, you probably would remember they're alive today. You can see the vestiges of these pagan deities. Chemosh was actually described as a being that would be heated up fiery red. He was usually molded in a seated position, and he's the one that the children of Israel were accused of passing their children through the fire. What they would do, they would heat him up cherry red and sit the baby in that God's lap. Sounds like Santa Claus. Hello? What about Ishtar? Ishtar is another name for Easter. And then you have Malcolm or Milcom, which means the great king. Are you seeing the connection here? Listen, these things are still in the house, and we're still having to deal with them. If we're not careful, we're going to be prostituting ourselves again, and that's what's happening. You see Yeshua releasing us from that curse, while Balaam keeps the price for himself. Balaam sold himself out for a price. Yeshua became the price. Are you seeing the difference? Balaam opens the doorway for the curse to continue. The prostitution of Israel is fomenting through the Moabite women and their gods. And then finally in Numbers 22:29, you see that Balaam beats this donkey because she had mocked him. And the word mocked here is the word Allah, which means to deal with severely, to make a mockery, but it can also infer to quench thirst. In other words, to satisfy one's lust and make someone drink again after a former drink. A cup of jealousy, the bitter cup of waters that was offered to the bride. If she drinks it and she's guilty, her belly and thigh rots out. Yet Yeshua becomes the price. He drinks the cup for you so that you no longer have to drink it. But if you reject the role of Messiah like Israel does here and prostitute yourself to the gods of the Moabites, then you're drinking the cup again. You follow me? Now, it's interesting because I believe this donkey represents Yeshua riding on the colt, the foal of an ass, who would mock the anti-Messiah. How? By drinking the bitter waters of jealousy for his bride. And it would force Ha-Satan, who's being acted out in the role of Balaam here, to strike the donkey. He strikes him twice, just like the rock was struck twice. Just like Yeshua, who was supposed to have only been struck one time so that you and I would never have to drink of that water again. You see the parallel continuing in this story. Now you know why Moses could not get away with striking the rock. He was struck one time. The second time he was only supposed to speak to them. So I believe that there's more to this story than just an individual who kind of went astray. Yes, he was a prophet of Yahweh, but he just kind of went astray and fell prey to some of his baser lusts. I don't think so. I think it was a calculated plot, a calculated scheme. I believe he was a soothsayer. I believe he was intentionally used to seduce the people of Israel. And again, the shadow picture is right in front of us. I believe that Balaam, in the form of the anti-Messiah, is going to arrive on the scene very shortly. And he's not going to be able to curse the people of Yahweh. He'll not be able to speak a word against Yahweh's people, but what he will do, he will teach the nations how to seduce you. And the opportunities will be set in front of you to entertain the gods of these other nations, these pagan deities. And if you're not careful, you'll be forced to drink of the cup again. Revelation 18:4 says, "Come out of her, my people." If you don't come out of her, the very plagues that were visited upon her, you will have visited on you. And her cup is going to be filled double, and double will be her judgment. Hope you've enjoyed this teaching. Thank you for listening. Shalom Aleichem.